The Powerhouse acknowledges the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians and the first astronomers of the land the Sydney Observatory is situated on. We pay our respects and seek guidance from their continuous connection to this place and to the sky country above us. On Time is a Powerhouse series recorded live at Sydney Observatory. We explore our experience of time over 4 conversations, weaving science, philosophy, and story. We're asking not just what time is, but how it governs our sense of self, and what shifts when we understand it differently. I'm Rachael Hocking, a Warlpiri woman, journalist and educator. I'll be guiding us through these conversations where you will meet the thinkers and storytellers I had the privilege of yarning with over the cycles and seasons of 2025. What does it mean to live across multiple temporalities at once? How do our memories, imaginations and lineages shape our experience of time? In this conversation on being in time, Professor Dean Rickles and novelist Shankari Chandran reflect on the complexities of moving psychologically, culturally and ethically through time. Dean Rickles is a professor of history and philosophy of modern physics at the University of Sydney and a co-director of the Centre for Time. His research explores how ideas like entropy, symmetry and information shape our understanding of temporal existence. His work often bridges physics with philosophical questions of finitude and how we come to understand the world through time. Shankari Chandran is an award-winning novelist and lawyer whose writing examines memory, migration and moral inheritance. Her novel Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens won the 2023 Miles Franklin Award, and across her works, including Song of the Sun God and Safe Haven, her characters move through time as a living thread, where past and present intertwine through family, ritual and story. Shankari, I want to start with you and hoping that you can help us, for those of us in the audience and on the panel who are unfamiliar with the concept, to introduce us to samsara, or ancestral time.
It's interesting you call it ancestral time. Where did that come from?
That's from my relationship to reading about samsara and my understanding of our relationship to deep time as Indigenous peoples. How would you frame it?
So I'd never seen it described as ancestral time. I think of it as essentially the cycle of birth, life and death. And it's a cycle that we, in Hinduism, are trapped in. And trapped makes it sound like something that is negative. And it ultimately is negative because we are trying to free ourselves from that cycle of birth, life and death. And the way that we live can acquire or accumulate karma. We're living through the karma from previous lives. You're probably very familiar with the concept of reincarnation. So samsara is that cycle of birth, life and death from which we are taught that we are to escape through karma or through other forms of yoga in which we realize our own divinity. So yoga not being what you understand to be yoga in the Western world, but disciplines that lead us towards our actual true self, which is divine in nature. And everything else, the body, the mind, all of these things are in many ways barriers to realizing our own divinity and are things to be overcome and are an illusion.
So curious about how this manifests when you're writing, because you're writing, you jump timelines, you move between chapters, places, eras and characters. How does samsara manifest when you're writing your novels?
In my sort of westernized, colonized mind even, ancestral time to me feels like we have a very strong sense of who our ancestors are. And our ancestors, though, being people that we are born from. So we are descendants of them, but we are born in the physical form as descendants of them. And that exists on one level, but it's still all part of this complex Maya, which is that illusion. Because actually, that sense of being born and descended from is how we make sense of our existence in the physical world. Beneath all of that and deep within us is a divine energy that is all the same. So the divine energy in me and the divine energy in my great-great-great-great-grandfather, who we now in English understand to be an ancestor, is the same divine energy. And my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and my purpose is the same purpose, which is to realize that divinity. And at that point, lineage is almost redundant. It's just almost like a game that we're all in on. We've all agreed to sign up to this idea that we live in the physical world. I got up this morning, I brushed my teeth, I went to work, I ate. And all of that seems meaningful to me. And yet actually what's really happening is that my soul is on a journey and my actions ultimately need to be geared towards assisting my soul to realize itself.
I'm so curious, Dina, what is your take on this conversation?
I mean, what is interesting is you mentioned the time in a novel, and there always seems to be, and in a lot of ancient systems as well, two time systems. And usually whenever you've got a cyclic time system, there's always something like eternity, right? There's a timeless realm, which it still has a sort of time, but it's eternity. And then there's a cycle. And the idea is that you are dropping out of union. Yoga means union, separating from the monad, right? The singular thing, assuming the illusion of separation for a bit. And then the journey is to go through all of these cause and effect cycles, these births and rebirths, to figure out that you actually belong to this thing all along. It's in the Indian cycles. It's obviously a core part of dream time, right? This split between times. There's the time that is just always there, and it's connected through sort of strange links to the thing we're wandering around in here. I mean, it's clearly a piece of perennial knowledge that we all have stuck in us somewhere, because it arises over and over, everywhere, across time, across geography and culture. You find it in Islamic systems, which relates even more closely to the novelist's system, because they have this sort of absolute time, which is where things that just are. And then they have this thing called metaphorical time. I think it's in the Ismaili system. A metaphorical time where you act as if things are like this and separate, and then you can go around it in your life. Eventually, you get to know it's an illusion, and you were never not part of this thing all along.
Our objective is to realize this. But I feel I should correct you as a Hindu to tell you that the Hindus actually came across this first. It is a running joke. It's not that funny a joke. It's more funny if you're Hindu, because they're just so proud of this idea that this concept that is perennial, as you say, is something that they feel has been within us and in that society for tens of thousands of years or more, if you believe the system of yugas.
In physics, though, it seems to sort of run away from this idea of cycles, because a cycle is something that doesn't have a beginning or an end, right? It's not something that was created. It's just the point is that it was always going on. Obviously, the big advance, if you want to call it that, of modern cosmology is that there was an origin, the Big Bang, which is the most without reason thing you can imagine, right? There's no explanation for the Big Bang, because an explanation would require to go before the Big Bang in order to explain it. So we have this mystery that starts things, and then if something starts, what's created has to end. But there are so many theories in cosmology that are attempting to put something cyclic back in. So there's these things called cyclic conformal cosmologies that say, okay, the universe is eventually going to a singularity and end in something like a big crunch, maybe, or something akin to that. This is one possibility. But when it does that, it gets reprocessed, and off it goes again. Or you can have bits where you go almost through the singularity and come out through the other side.
Where do you arrive?
Well, that would be another Big Bang. So you'd have to wait again. I mean, if you're talking about something that has many births and rebirths and cycles, that's something that needs to be judged relative to something else, right? You can only count these things and make sense of cycles relative to an independent sort of perspective that's judging them. As soon as you bring this cyclic concept in, you're almost forced to have this extra realm.
The person in me that wants to resist dogma is frustrated, in a sense, by my own acceptance, essentially, because we were born into that cultural tradition. So I don't know anything other than a cycle of birth and death and a journey towards my own self. So when people say to me, when they talk about heaven and they talk about being with God and they talk about this sort of end of life and what happens after the end of life, I mean, I'm not disrespectful of it. I just don't understand it because it's so deeply ingrained in me that we will be on this ever-repeating loop until we free ourselves of it to understand who we truly are.
Does writing help provide that purpose in unpacking your relationship to these conversations?
I think so. My point there was just that I feel like you're explaining it to me through science, and it's wonderful because for me, it's almost just something that was taught to me from the time I was a child by my grandmother. In terms of my writing, I feel like my own writing is actually my own spiritual progress. It is my way of connecting with myself. So I feel most closely connected to myself when I am writing. It's the kind of joy that I assume to be spiritual union. And it feels like it's something that is helping me fulfill my karma because the writing in this life is very specifically around the injustices that were suffered by the Tamil people. And so there is a kind of higher purpose to it. And therefore, within that, a sense that this is my duty to do this. It's my dharma. And I am fulfilling my karma by being born into this life in which I am able to do that.
I'm curious, Dean, how the exposure to non-Western philosophies have impacted yourself and then maybe your colleagues. Has it been a barrier, a challenge? Have there been healthy conversations that actually engage Indigenous and Sansara and different ways of seeing the world?
There's a lot of overlap between what I've been working on recently and the older systems and Indigenous systems. And I was led there by following physics to its edges, basically, which is quantum gravity. Quantum gravity is a situation where you're pushing your two fundamental theories to their limits, trying to get them to go together, because we seem to have one single world. We've got these two theories. One describes matter and energy, one describes space-time. You would think, given that there's one world, that they would fit together. But they don't. There's no way of fitting them together using our ordinary concepts of space-time and matter. So I've sort of pushed into thinking what might be beyond space-time and matter, into more abstract domains. And where you can't help but end up is looking at these other systems where you have something like a space of potentiality or chaos. It almost goes into esoteric realms. There's a realm of chaos that space-time and matter, our world, has to be birthed from. And a Big Bang just doesn't cut it, right? It's not sufficient. You need to go and explain what are the building materials out of which this thing is created. And it has to be non-spatial, non-temporal, and non-material, because they're the things that we're trying to build. You can't use them to build with because you need something else that isn't your building materials. And so a lot of the recent work I've been doing has overlapped with even things like Advaita Vedanta, the not two systems. I've developed with colleagues an approach that starts from a undifferentiated totality, right? A one, but you can't really call it one either because that's pinning it down. But it's just sort of like a formless primordial chaos that must be split into a subject and object to manifest a world, which is basically Advaita Vedanta. It's almost identical, but we've managed to fit it into modern physics and show how you can merge it with quantum mechanics in a completely natural way and get a new interpretation of quantum mechanics that's completely different and fits very, very well with these other systems. It's almost like a non-Western physics.
Well, this is the thing. So the Advaita concept of oneness, essentially you start by being taught that God exists in the form that it's manifested in. So you'll know Lord Shiva, you'll know Ganesha, the elephant god, you'll be familiar with some of these things from Western culture or your knowledge of South Asian culture. And then you're supposed to not need the form anymore to worship. And then you start to see what we call God in Western culture as an energy that exists outside you that you are reaching for. As you progress, you realize that actually you're not reaching for something outside. You are one with that and have been all along. So there's a kind of maturing of your spiritual understanding as you go, which ultimately ends in the Advaita philosophy.
Yeah. That's almost a definition of enlightenment, right? Is realizing that the subject-object split, the self and other split, was actually an illusion.
I'd like to ask you, Dean, to talk a bit about one of your recent works, Life is Short. You talk about the finitude of life and how that in and of itself is where life can derive meaning from. So firstly, before I go into a few of the inspirations for the book, you wrote some of this during COVID lockdown?
All of it.
What was that experience like?
Well, it was weirdly enjoyable because usually I'm sort of like bouncing from one thing to the next. So I wouldn't have paused, I wouldn't have turned my attention away from physics. This was a sort of radical shift to something completely different. So with the limitations of your living space, because you can't go out, the idea of death and the fact that it could all end, even the idea that there was a sort of existential risk about it, that everything might end. So that also goes into the book, actually, the idea of what if this is like the last generation and everybody ends? Like, what happens to your projects if there's no collective afterlife to witness and carry on your projects and these kind of things? So the book, weirdly, started off as connected to the physics project that I was going to be working on, which had to do with these things called participatory approaches to physics. So the idea is, in quantum mechanics, there's kind of no way the world is until you've specified particular types of measurement to then allow it to realize itself and put itself into particular outcomes. So you don't get a definite outcome, you always get a set of probabilities, but which set of probabilities you get will depend on whether you say, I'm going to measure spin up in this axis or this axis or this axis. Doesn't know what it's going to do. So it's the human participation of asking it a question first that then allows it to provide an answer. So we both end up with this freedom. The world is in a free state where it's full of potential. We are in a state full of potential in our ability to ask a free question. Superposition is what you would use to describe the way the world is out there, i.e. not in one state or the other. It's neither up or down or, a combination or anything like that. It's in a true state of nothingness. So then I sort of got led down the path of nothingness and the power of the participator in bringing about reality, co-creating reality, essentially. To bring it back to time, there was the idea that we're making choices and bringing things about, but those choices wouldn't really have any meaning unless there was some sort of time pressure on them. We think of our choices, what we decide, as making our life, essentially. You can almost imagine you're born at the base of a tree with a lot of branches, and you're evolving, and it's just full of possibility at the beginning. You've got the full set of branches that you could go down. But we don't go down all of them at once, and the point of the book is that it's good that we can't go down all branches at once. We have to select. So as we're going through the tree and the branches, we have to say, I'm going to have to let that one go. Now and again, we can backtrack and go back to it, but some are completely irreversible, right? I mean, childbirth, there's a point at which it becomes, even with technology, sort of impossible. So if you imagine you start with your I am, and then there's a sort of a question mark there, and you're adding a catalogue of properties as you go through these branches, and as you do that, you're letting other ones go. And at the end, the choices you made are what basically carves your existence. If you could have done them all, you wouldn't have a self. It would just be a diffuse entity. So the limitations and having to be forced to select them and having the finitude of time to bring the urgency is essential. This is why we have midlife crises, because we get to a middle point and we think, oh, shit, like there are possibilities that are now no longer here. And I didn't like that I chose that possibility. So now I'm going to have to recorrect and use this remaining time really well so I don't make any mistakes. And then at the end, you're zero possibilities. You're done.
So Shankari, how does that feel for you? We talk about living in the moment and being present. We hear that a lot. What's your relationship to the limitations on time and how it affects your life and your experience?
So different from that, I think. I'm still distracted by the fact that the world was about to end, or you contemplated a possible existential crisis and you were worried about your projects. But we can discuss that later. When I think of time in its finitude, for the most part, the pervasive thinking for me is that I have, between now and whenever my physical body dies, in order to live out and live through whatever karma I've accrued in previous lives, and to accumulate sufficient karma in this life without being attached to the consequences of my actions, as Krishna said to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, in order to potentially free myself so that this life is my last life. and that I'm not reborn. So in a sense, I have infinite lives. And I think about the fact that I have had many lives before and I have many lives potentially to come. And so it feels as though for me, my existence is not just Shankari Chandran, born 1974, died whenever in the future, but rather that that's one period of one life and that there may well be another life, although my aspiration is that there shouldn't be another life. So I'm almost asking myself a much longer game question. How am I living this life in order to set myself up so that there isn't a next life?
Is there a sense of knowing about that next life and about whether you've achieved what you set out to?
I think that's entirely subjective and a cause for much argument amongst Hindus. Because how can you know? What would you know? I do feel that this life, this dharma for me, is about writing the story of what happened in Sri Lanka. And the way that things move into place to enable me to do that, you might describe them as coincidence, you might describe them as luck. In some cultures we call it fate, in some we call it karma. It all facilitates me pursuing the writing of these stories about Sri Lanka.
What burning karma requires, if you're doing it consciously, well, you need to be aware, right? So how would you get that awareness? Is it sort of seeing that circumstances keep arranging themselves in a certain pattern and, oh, he must be trying to get me to deal with this?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's entirely subjective, isn't it? We're making this shit up as we go along. And in fact, in my current manuscript, one of the things that I'm exploring is the fact that this Hindu scripture that we receive as the truth is originally from an oral tradition, forced into being a described tradition through writing, and often forced because of the presence of colonial powers that threatened to erase the existence of God's truth, as you would describe it in Western thinking, but divine truth in Eastern thinking, broadly speaking, then forced into being written in a language that's no longer used, translated and written often by men of a particular caste within Hinduism. And then we receive it as a truth. And so part of what I'm exploring in this manuscript is really how do we interrogate the truth? What is the truth from that religious or spiritual or doctrinal perspective?
On the business of making shit up. So we never experience death, right? We don't really experience our finitude. We always experience life. I mean, it's always an extrapolation through the two ends, birth and death. So you're almost forced always into stories. So you can have the mythological stories, but even physics is doing that. All we've got still when we're doing physics is whatever we've got coming through our senses, and everything is remote inference. So you end up making stories about the cycles of time and cosmology, but they're just the same kind of stories. And I guarantee in even 50 years, we'll have a completely different set of stories in cosmology, despite how hard they say this is, because it's a model, it's a story. Inferences are stories.
And so, Dean, what about what Shankari was just telling us about the impact of our time and stories when we are exposed to genocide, colonization, grief and trauma? Can you just give us maybe an opening of what you understand to be the impact of grief and trauma on our experiences of time?
It's something that happened in the past, so you're always going to be based in memory, almost living in virtual reality. And even though your present experience will be sort of replaying or constantly colored by this previous memory, I mean, it's hard to speak of an absolute memory anyway. And we all know as we go through life that we sort of revise entirely how we see certain events, and what was negative we can even make positive. So how you frame it. Trauma is basically framing it a certain way. Trauma comes from the German word for dream. You're forced into this sort of strange state where you're never completely present, and then you can't create your future properly because you're trapped.
How does that connect to the way you experience talking and writing and capturing intergenerational trauma in your characters? Is there a disruption that you're thinking about in that process?
So almost all of my work is about generational trauma, the trauma of an individual, the trauma within families, the trauma of an entire people. And in that exploration of trauma. Every time we remember something, we remember it differently. We are ultimately incredibly unreliable narrators of our own story. For the fiction writer, that is an opportunity in terms of a tool. At the same time, as a writer of fact that is integrated into fiction, I have a responsibility to present that trauma, explore it and honor it in a particular way, because I'm seeking, if not a justice outcome, because there is no justice in Sri Lanka, a way of creating a record of the generations of trauma, of why we had that war, what happened during it, what happened at the very end, and what happened afterwards. And so in that sense, memory and trauma is always present. And I remember being at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and there was a Sinhalese writer, Shankari Chandran, the Booker Prize winner, and I'm ethnically Tamil, he's ethnically Sinhalese, and we were asked, why do Sri Lankan writers always write about war? And he said, I don't think we should write about war. I don't know why we have to, we shouldn't. And my response to that was, well, as a Tamil, everything is about the war, because why we left is because of the war. There were consequences for those that stayed, and there were consequences for those that left. So the book itself doesn't necessarily have to be about the war, but the war will always be there because it's always with us. In terms of the sort of psychology of trauma, time has collapsed. What you experienced 40 years ago and how you behave today are inextricably linked. You're carrying it in the cells of your body. So when I write, I'm trying to bring those memories, that trauma, the physicality of it, the emotion of it, the consequences of it, into the written word in a way that honors what people have experienced and suffered and survived.
It is impossible to separate what happened to our ancestors to what we are witnessing every single day. I wonder how you feel or relate or connect or think about the term truth-telling.
I connect to it very strongly. In Sri Lanka, there's Tamil people who've been colonized 4 times. I have no discomfort, for example, recognizing that this is a colonized land in a way that I sometimes see the resistance to that and the discomfort around accepting the concept of colonization, even though we know it to be true. And I wonder if, because of my own background, where we were colonized many times, it's almost like oh yes, I totally understand that. And not in a flippant manner, but just in a manner that is our everyday lived experience. And so as you say, it's impossible to separate the past from the present because you live it and you see it in a way that people who have not had that lived experience don't.
Is it just enough time passing that will allow colonization events to, I don't know, do what they've done? Because it's obviously happened throughout history. It's like a pattern of humans that they do this kind of thing. Is it something that requires witnessing?
Those events and the events before those don't need us to draw lines in the sand to say we're moving on from that. It's not about separating that experience. I'm curious about this need to move on. There is a great expression popularised by Indigenous X, an Indigenous media company, but I'm not sure where it originated. Colonisation is an ongoing event. There's no before, during or after. It's just this thing that we're experiencing. And that's part of accepting what it means to be an Indigenous person today, to not limit us to being in museum exhibits, to being defined by our trauma. It's about all those things, all those realities.
And what it means to be human, not just what it means to be Indigenous, because we are all colonised or colonising. So to your question about truth-telling, and what does truth-telling mean? Truth-telling through fiction, which is what I do, is vital because so much of the truths of what happened in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is in no way different from any other place in the world where atrocities have been committed and then erased. But when you go to Sri Lanka, depending on which ethnic group you ask, you'll get a completely different version of what happened in that war. and how many people died. And so truth-telling becomes critical to understanding our history, which has led us to our present. In the barrier, I try to explore this idea that we are doomed to continually repeat the mistakes of the past, but truth-telling is about trying to give us a fighting chance of not doing that, a fighting chance of remembering what we've done, what the consequences are of that for everybody, and then maybe taking a moment and saying, actually, maybe we don't do that again this time.
I think ancestral knowledge comes into play as well when we talk about remembering. I guess I'm curious about your relationship to your ancestors, Dean.
I mean, I'm very much of my roots, working class. There's still a class divide in England. I mean, it's nothing like these situations that you've been through, but you are linked to your past through the rituals, and you pick up your pattern from your ancestral line. So how I assume things ought to be done is basically born from that lineage. It doesn't have to be sort of religious rituals or anything like that. It's just pattern. Our ancestry is just built from passing down these patterns of doing things, which are often repetitions. They're cyclic in themselves. At a certain point, a certain time of the year, you do a certain thing. When a certain event happens, you should act accordingly when it repeats. Everybody is built from their ancestors. Problem is we often clash right through our patterns, and some people, as in colonization, want to put their pattern, which they think is the better pattern, on top of another pattern.
Just a few reflections on what you're talking about. That ritual, the part that it plays in anchoring us to time, but also maybe reflections that either of you have about how the world around us pulls us away from those anchors, from those rituals, and can be a personal reflection on how that's impacted you or the people around you, or just broadly speaking. Shankari, what do you reckon?
So I've been thinking about this a little bit because I'm getting older and my children are getting older and family members in the generations above us are passing away. So the rituals of death become the rituals that we engage in more than the rituals of life. Coming of age, marriage, babies and children have rituals in between. Those rituals as a child that we participated in kept us very anchored to community, whether we understood the ritual or not. And often as a younger diasporic generation would either resist the ritual or try to give it a meaning of our own. So, for example, rituals around a girl coming of age have a very specific sort of economical meaning underneath because she's ready for marriage. But we would try to reinvent that ritual to mean something else, to mean an understanding of now your body's potential. There's a sort of sense of reclaiming ritual and rewriting ritual, but also losing ritual because we are becoming increasingly westernized, and the rituals kept us anchored to our communities. They kept us anchored almost in a sense of having a village mentality, with everyone understanding their rituals and everyone meeting at the temple. And it wasn't just about the temple because each family had its own rituals every day, often centered around worship. And then that had a time cycle itself, rituals of the week. So I feel a sense of disconnect and concern around that. And in some ways, maybe this is inevitable. You become diasporic, you drift, you merge, and is that such a bad thing? And at the same time, I'm asking myself, well, how do we hold on to the richness of what it means or meant to be Tamil and let go of the bad parts of what it means to be Tamil and work out how to contribute that to the new world that we live in and that our children will live in? So much of my work has been about the preservation of culture and ritual. And the initial motivation of that was really to honor my ancestors and to create something for my children.
From the point of view of Western science, progressively, our theory of cosmology is sort of being detached from the goings-on in everyday reality. The idea that the cycles of nature provide the scaffolding of facilitating these sorts of events. We have a few still, but they tend not to be so hooked into nature. Even with our measurement systems, our solar year, 365, maps quite nicely onto nature, but our moon one doesn't. It's an artificial cycle, and then everything else, the 7-day week, is artificial. It comes from the Jewish system. There was an 8-day system. Persians have a 7-7-8-8 system. Where I'm going now is basically trying to find ways of getting something like that back in our worldview so that we're connected to nature more.
Thank you. I appreciate your insights. Can we please put our hands together for our wonderful panel? On Time is a series from the Powerhouse. This conversation featured Professor Dean Rickles and Shankari Chandran and was hosted by me, Rachael Hocking. Our program curator is Bobby Virgona, and this podcast was produced, edited and sound designed by Mara Schwerdtfeger. These conversations were recorded live by Ben Rumble and Ryan Carter at the Sydney Observatory on Gadigal land. Powerhouse Head of Program is Claire Holland, Head of Digital is Callum Cooper, and the commissioning editor is Lisa Havilah. Special thanks to the Centre for Time and the team at Sydney Observatory. To keep up to date with the latest episodes and new content from the Powerhouse, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.